Welcome, everyone, and thank you for participating in today's SDG Academy. I'm Martha, and I will be your host. Our topic for today's lecture is on SDG 6, Clean Water and Sanitation. And today we deep dive into the recent United Nations Water Conference in light of the World Water Day celebrated last March 22nd. After the discussion by our three experts joining us today, we will have a Q&A. So please keep in mind any questions you might have and share them with us at the end of the presentations. Also here with us today is Amsterdam Sustainability Institute Director, Professor Philip Papberg, to introduce ASI and our speakers. Philip?
Yeah, thank you, Marta. Great. Thanks for the introduction and for the organization, and also to everyone online. It's great to have you here because I cannot see all of you. But if you like to switch the cameras on, that's also welcome. To our SDG Academy organized by the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute. And the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute is the university's, the FU's platform for interdisciplinary interfaculty research on the SDG. So our job is to bring together people who sit in different faculties, who work on the hard sciences, on the humanities, on the social sciences, and to think about common problems such as water. And I hope that the experts that we invited today will agree that water is a quintessential cross-cutting issue that cannot be understood from any particular perspective. And I think if one thing became clear during the last couple of days at the UN 2023 Water Conference is that water is a cross-cutting issue, also in relation to all the SDGs, because water is its own SDG, SDG 6, but it's also understood more and more, I would say, that water is a cross-cutting issue, and it's important, if not crucial, for the realization of many other sustainable development goals. So in that spirit, we're super excited to have experts with us today that are not only experts on water governance, water politics, but also have been participating in the recent UN Water Conference. That conference took place from the 22nd to the 24th of March in New York. And I read about it a little bit, and I understood that it was the first global conference at the UN on water for 50 years. I couldn't really figure out what the first one, so the last one was 50 years ago, but maybe some of you know that. But I understood it has been a long time in the making. So this conference has been looking at SDG 6, but also other SDGs. But it's good to remember that it's also part of the ongoing decade on, so the UN decade on action on water and sanitation that runs from 2018 to 2028, and sort of a midterm point for evaluation. And this conference also is part of that process. Interestingly, the conference was convened by the UN General Assembly and was facilitated and supported by UN DESA and UN Water, but was also co-hosted by two countries. And those countries were Tajikistan and the Netherlands. And that was very surprising to me because I haven't read anything about that in Dutch news, which is maybe a different topic we can talk about, why this hasn't got the attention that I think it should have. But the Netherlands was in fact the co-host of this conference, which makes a lot of sense. I read a little bit on the website of the foreign ministry of the Netherlands, where they started with, well, we are basically underwater and this country shouldn't be where it is, but it is, and we're so good in making sure the water doesn't come in, and that's why we part of this conference. Good. Beyond that, what was actually on the agenda? I'm sure we will hear a lot about that from our colleagues in a second, but something that I remembered was this very nice, catchy slogan. Sometimes we have too much water, sometimes we have too little water, and often the water is too polluted. So these are definitely three of the large challenges that we have with water, that there is drought, there's flooding, but there's also increasing water pollution, and water cross-cutting is a real challenge. So this conference was meant to gather all existing initiatives, a spirit of goodwill to fight that problem. I think because many people realize that we're not on track with the actual implementation of SDG 6 or the decade on water and sanitation. So I'm looking forward to hear what actually went down, what was decided, and what your assessment is of that, because it's one thing to go to New York and enjoy a nice UN summit, and the other is to take an honest and critical assessment of what it has delivered. So without much further ado, I'm super happy to introduce our three speakers of today. They all are part of New Wave, which is Next Water Governance, an EU Marie Curie network, and they all have different roles there. So let me start with Dona, Geagea, an early stage researcher in the New Wave network. I think you have been physically in New York, so you might be a little jet lagged, and your research touches on questions around recommoning water resources. We have Paulina Raniecka, and Paulina is an affiliated New Wave researcher, an external PhD with the FU. And I'm not sure, Paulina, if you have been in New York or just, yeah, you have been. Okay, so check. Also maybe jet lagged. Paulina's research is particularly on the intersection of water, justice, and sustainability. And then last but not least, we have the leader, the coordinator of the New Wave project, Dr. Jampel Dell'Angelo. Jampel is an associate professor here at the FU, at the Institute for Environmental Studies, and also jet lag, maybe, because Jampel has been in New York as well. And I'm looking forward to hear from you firsthand what we make of this UN 2023 conference on water. Without much further ado, thanks a lot for joining us, everyone. And I give the floor to Dona.
Thank you very much, Philip. Thanks for your enthusiasm and also for giving us the opportunity to share some of our reflections, definitely fresh off the press, if I may say so, because we're still trying to process the magnitude of the information and observations that we had, and also the reflections from this conference. I'm just going to share my slides with you all. There we go. And so, as you have mentioned, this was a historic event, and I'll highlight that a little bit more. And I think both Paulina and Jampel will go a little deeper on some of the content. But what I would like to highlight and bring forward is the early stage researchers, of which I am a part. There's 15 of us within New Wave. And we brought forward a policy brief to the UN Water Conference on the problem that we've identified from our own research on 15 different topics of water governance, looked at through different lenses. And it was that there's limited reflexivity on water governance in both academic and policy arenas, but that actually this was reaffirmed at the conference. And I'll speak to this a little bit more. You've already introduced New Wave, so I will skip that slide. Indeed, a historic water event. Yes, 46 years have passed since the last one in Mar del Plata in Argentina. And the last one, in fact, sort of set the tone for the next decades of water governance and what was talked about and the decisions that were made. But since then, there hasn't been a UN-level water governance conference or summit or event, other than some other events that have been happening, which I'm sure everyone here is aware of. There are national water weeks that different countries organize. There's also the World Water Forum, which takes place, I believe, every 3 years. And the only challenge with World Water Forums is, from my perspective, they're highly, let's say, corporately funded. And so the difference here was that the UN event would be a space that's really inviting a more high-level conversation on water governance outside, at least we hoped, of this corporate dominant views and perspectives. So indeed, this one in particular convened approximately 7,000 people. There were nearly 700 voluntary commitments that were made. Pledges amounted to $300 billion US. And there was an agreement to establish a UN special envoy on water. This will be important because it's about having a sort of follow-up mechanism on some of the commitments made at this conference, which are all voluntary. And it showed that there is a renewed political momentum around putting water back as a priority on the UN agenda. So definitely an effort to be commended. Yes, very important and also very timely. But why the disappointment? So I put here the title Bells and Whistles, and the show goes on, and I believe Jampel will speak even more to this. In reflecting in retrospect on what we experienced at the conference, I realized how good we've become as humanity to put on a big show. Here was the opportunity to open up the halls of high-level UN decision-making, which is typically done by state actors, to the public, but the public felt very much sidelined. So at best, there were side events that were hosted on site, which in this photo, you can see the size of the room, and often they were completely packed. Many people couldn't attend. That happened to me a few times, where if you arrived just a bit too late, you could not even enter because it was so packed. There's not enough space to listen into the dialogue that was happening. And if you were not so lucky, you would have a virtual or side event off-site. For example, the side events for New Wave were off-site, but we welcomed that opportunity because it actually meant that if we did it virtually or hybrid, we could invite those who couldn't be in person inside the walls of the UN could participate in some of these conversations. But my disappointment was that certainly it's carbon footprints that were piled up, mine included, to listen to already made decisions. So member states were presenting statements. Everyone seemed to be putting forward their agenda on what they've done and showcasing their projects and their work. But it left very little room for dialogue. So for me, that's what was really missing. At best, in these side events, you could ask 1 or 2 questions. There was not even an interaction between the speakers, who at times had very opposing perspectives. So the dialogue component was a really missed opportunity for being in such a space and having convened such a number of people. So ultimately, for me, the power dynamics in water governance continued to go unquestioned, and the room size and the loudness of the mics represented the attention given to particular issues and actors and not to others. I will organize some of these thoughts into how we presented the policy brief. And in fact, what I mentioned, which is that our policy brief key points were affirmed for us after we attended this conference. So within our policy brief, in which we highlighted that there is a limited reflexivity within both academic and policy arenas on who is doing water governance, how it's being done, and for what purpose. This, for me, went largely unaddressed. From the sessions that I attended, I hardly heard anyone speak to some of these questions or even problematize some of it. So in our policy brief, we put forward this notion through 3 salient points. The first one is about dominant approaches and paradigms in water governance that continue to lead to the neglect of critical perspectives. And what we mean by this is dominant approaches being ones with neoliberal tendencies. For example, the paradigm of integrated water resource management continues to be pushed through SDG 6.5, when in fact there has been research conducted on problematizing how it's being implemented and its impact on the ground in different parts of the world. Paradigms of control were very prominent. For example, Kenya committed to building 100 dams in the next 5 years. And this is just one example of this notion of controlling water. And these went largely unquestioned, but it was very minimal to see or to hear, for example, critical thinking perspectives around feminist approaches, political ecology lenses, decolonial or post-colonial theories. And these were, if present, often subdued as marginal narratives. The second point is around power dynamics between actors that create imbalances in discourses and knowledge systems. For this one, I just want to give a clear example, because for me, this became visible through the co-optation of discourse that through my research, as you mentioned, Philip, my research is about recommoning water. And I conduct a lot of interviews and work with activists in the water movement. And I hear a lot notions about water stewardship and collective action. And so the way that these terms are used from the perspective of social movements, or even if you hear it from elders or leaders in indigenous communities, what's being talked about there is a type of custodianship, a type of caretaking, a type of protecting water for future generations. And what I heard in one particular session that I attended, titled Common Good Outcomes Through Water Stewardship, which was very much dominated by multinational corporations presenting what they are touting as water stewardship, as collective action, which in my opinion, and from what I heard, was reduced to actions like planting trees, working with water aid to promote hand washing and better sanitation, to decrease absenteeism of employees at the factory sites, and at best, reducing the water footprint. For example, one of these companies, which was a beverage production company, had its production site in the north of Brazil, and even talked about having to shut down its production for 3 days due to a drought and a state of emergency. And then they talked about this as adapting, because after 3 days they resumed production. And when you think about it, and this notion of transformation that was also frequently used, you can't but ask yourself, what type of transformation is this really? What type of adapting is it really? Why aren't we asking the question of whether in the first place it's the right place for these companies to have their production sites set up when they're producing highly water intensive products and probably shipping them across the world to be consumed in northern countries? So some of those discussions were very much missing. The notion of water crisis was said at every statement and every session. But what was missing for me was the nuance of the water crisis being a human-made crisis, being a crisis of poor water management and governance and poor water allocation. So again, this needs to be problematized, and I did not see that happening much. And also co-creation was touted as the new paradigm, but I was missing hearing about who's co-creating with whom and for whom. And the final point that we put forward in our policy brief was around limited accessibility of water-related data, which impedes further research and decision-making processes. But this, in fact, is much more than just limited accessibility to water data, which, of course, we problematized by asking who is controlling this data, because often, also from our own research and bumping up against some of these limitations, we were unable to access certain data that was kind of held in certain governance institutes, private companies. And so we were inviting some deeper reflexivity on what kind of data is being collected and for whom and by whom, and how can we make this more open source to really improve decision-making processes. So on a final note, I will close by putting forward what was missing from our brief in a process of reflexivity. Actually, we invited through this brief, we used it as a tool for dialogue. So we put some provocations and questions, which I will put in the chat, actually a link to the policy brief, as well to a graphic that we created to make it more accessible. And within this, we invited, through our side event, a discussion with our guest speakers to let us know what else is missing from our brief that we haven't paid attention to. And we were informed that we need to have a stronger call for acknowledging the more than human in these discussions. So even our brief was still had an anthropocentric bias. That is something we are acknowledging, and we hope to deepen our reflexivity and reflection through our positionality as academics and researchers in the water governance space. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. And I believe now I pass it to Paulina.
Yeah, first of all, thanks, Dona, from my side. There's already so many interesting points and questions that I've written down. So thanks for that, and pointing to the missing reflexivity, not only of water governance in general, but also parts or the entire conference in particular. So I think that's very, very interesting to hear as a start. And indeed, we will continue with Paulina. So let's do that without further ado. Paulina, you're welcome to share with us your thoughts and observations.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. Let me change this to this. Okay. So first of all, thank you so much, Dona, for this. I think that was the perfect introduction to this more critical reflection on the UN Water Conference. I will follow up with focusing on this theme of human water problems and their representation in the UN Water Conference. and whether we saw a good representation and a good way of addressing the most pressing human water problems in New York last week. So as already mentioned by both Philip and Dona, the 2023 Water Conference organized by UN was definitely a historic moment. It's been almost 50 years since the previous one. And rightly so, you know, this whole environment and hype, so to say, was rightly so created, as the UN 2023 Water Conference was also referred to as the 2023 Conference for the Midterm Comprehensive Review of Implementation of the UN Decade for Action on Water and Sanitation. Quite a mouthful. So we see that we are very much in the midpoint of the UN Decade for Action. And to just bring it up, there are two main goals that were set up back in 2018, and that was to improve knowledge sharing related to water and water pollution control, and to improve communication to achieve the water-related SDGs. As we already mentioned, water is very much omnipresent, and it's much more than just a few SDGs. It's very much interwoven in different goals and in our everyday life. And the theme of water and water problems is quite complex. So it kind of came quite naturally, being at the conference, to also conduct my own review, my own assessment, so to say, and to actually see whether the organizers did a good job, essentially, at discussing and addressing those most pressing human water issues. So what I want to do, and this is very early stages, it's a research of mine, so to say, that I am beginning, is to really assess whether UN Water Conference addressed the most pressing issues, considering what has been discussed in the scientific literature in the last more or less 20 years. So do we see an alignment or maybe complete lack thereof? So what I started doing, as I said, it's very early stage, so I'll give you a bit of a taste, is I used a database that we've been creating with New Wave Network, a database that collects global human water problems from the last almost 20 years. And I used that as the base point to understand what the most pressing water issues are. So just a little bit about the methodology. The way we did it is we conducted a systematic literature review of scientific sources from the water governance field. We looked specifically to Scopus and looked for peer-reviewed articles from the period of 2004 and 2022, so nearly 20 years. And we scanned them, searching for relevant articles, and then proceeded with coding. We searched, among other things, for the problem that each author, each paper discussed. And we start creating a certain problem typology to understand which issues have been put center stage within the academic scholarship. And with this in mind, quite naturally, this question came up: okay, has this typology actually been reflected in the sessions created and organized for the UN 2023 conference? So first, I'm gonna give you a brief overview of the results of the systematic literature review. We're at the final stages, so we're nearly done with it. And what you can see is, out of the 405 papers that we've coded so far, water governance issues have by far been the larger cluster of human water problems, followed by water quantity issues. Then we also had water quality that appeared in many cases, water-related conflicts, extreme weather conditions, wash, so water and sanitation and hygiene. And what's an interesting thing is that from around 2010, I would say 2012, this focus on indigenous communities' involvement in water started taking also center stage. And within these larger clusters, there are certain specific themes, specific problems that are discussed. So within water quantity, we see that water scarcity or growing water demand have been by far the most commonly discussed ones. Within water governance, there's also certain subsections. We have participation issues, distribution of water, but also sanitation systems, also investment technical solutions. Here, you would have a lot of papers focusing on infrastructure problems. Within water quality, there's also different types of pollutions and quality issues, and so on and so forth. And what I then proceeded to do is I started with a content analysis. It's once again early stages for that, and I looked through the program, the official program for the UN conference, and first began by just searching terms, notions that would reoccur. So for each day, Dona provided a screenshot. For each day, there was a program for different time slots, and it was an overwhelming amount. And as she mentioned as well, there were sessions that were inside the UN, there were sessions that were outside of the UN headquarters. There were also sessions online. There's a really, really great variety of sessions and great variety of topics. So what we see is that by far, transboundary and regional water cooperation and resilience, both water and climate resilience, have been the biggest themes that kept coming up, followed by partnerships, WASH, indigenous perspectives or experiences, practices, gender, water crisis, also mentioned by Dona, very, very often mentioned in different sessions. Also the word acceleration, and I think that's, the focus on this actionability, the fact that we do need to start working. And it's actually, it was one of those moments, one of the sessions where I heard the head of Bayer, so one of the biggest pharmaceutical producer, saying, okay, water, there's so many different issues, so complex, but we need to start somewhere. And to me, it was also mind-blowing to hear, first of all, this kind of a speaker saying halfway through the UN Water Action Decade to say we need to start. We're already halfway, but we need to start. So you definitely have a lot of acceleration, accelerating. That was definitely a big word. Alongside the side sessions, you had the interactive dialogue sessions. So these were the official plenaries. That's where you had the representatives of different countries. You had the representatives of large organizations, companies, and they were only a few of them. They would be sessions of around 3 hours. So it's also quite crucial to look into what has been selected, essentially to make the cut. So we see that WASH, human right to water, to sanitation was mentioned. I wouldn't say it was very critically discussed, but it was definitely mentioned. Valuing water, definitely this economic, more monetary consideration of water was there. Water, energy, food nexus, resilience, as already mentioned, and cooperation were very much the big buzzwords. And to do a bit more of a quantitative analysis, very beginning stage of it, we had 6 sessions devoted to water quality, but most of the time it would just be a mention of water quality. There was one session that distinguished within the water quality that they will be tackling plastic. There were 2 sessions on water use in agriculture, but there was not one session that mentioned the theme of agricultural pollution. 14 sessions on water governance. These mainly centered in specific contexts, mainly in Africa or other areas of the non-Western world. 16 sessions on water quantity, mainly water stress and scarcity. Also the issue of water accessibility. 2 sessions, only 2 sessions on water conflicts, one on armed conflicts, and the other one was on conflict-induced migration, so also a bit more of the background theme. 4 sessions on weather extremes, 3 devoted to droughts, none to floods, which I think is quite alarming as well, considering that floods by far were the most widely discussed weather extreme within the scientific literature of the last 20 years. 21 sessions on WASH and 6 sessions on indigenous experiences in governing water. When it comes to this indigenous experiences in governing water, that was also, quite interesting. And that's something that Dona mentioned as well, that the setup of the sessions didn't really allow for critical reflection, didn't really allow for a good dialogue. And yeah, maybe I'll go into that in a second as I'm going to be concluding now. So as I said, it's early stages for now when it comes to this reflection, but there's definitely a prevalence of certain discourses and themes, certain buzzwords, certain key terms that have been used. In many cases, there is a disparity in what the scientific literature focuses on, or rather what kind of importance they place on given theme in comparison to the focus of the UN Water Conference. And what we saw, and this is exactly what I wanted to bring up, is that very often a certain theme would just be brought up in the description of the session, or it would be very much in the background, but it wouldn't be the key focus. And you could see that also with the type of speakers that were brought in. So there were a lot of speakers, especially in the first day, there was a lot of speakers that were representatives of indigenous communities. And there were also a lot of youth speakers. But in most cases, these speakers were asked to make their statements and then not really engaged in any discussion with any other panelists, nor the audience, or they were just asked to make the closing statements, especially when it comes to the youth representatives. In many cases, one of our early stage researchers from our network was actually the youth representative for one of the sessions. And it was quite frustrating to see that no one would really engage with her. She would be there more to tick the box. And this issue of tokenism comes about that you saw that very often you felt that certain themes or certain people were there more to tick a box, more to, say, okay, checked, we have it covered, rather than actually critically engaged. And what I want to see is there, whether there's a disparity between locations, because the data I've used for this brief introductory analysis was from the sessions on the inside of the UN, in the UN headquarters. But I am expecting a difference also in the outside locations and the online sessions. And I did experience that firsthand as well, where I went to a session on elevating indigenous voices and indigenous knowledge. And that was outside of the UN headquarters. And you really saw that in that session, the indigenous speakers were the leaders of the session. And there was a lot of critical discussion. There was a lot of engagement in between them. And there was a lot of engagement also with the audience. And that's something that we really missed. Just like Dona already mentioned, very often there wasn't even time to ask a question. Often there wasn't even a discussion between the panelists, let alone a discussion with the audience. And I also saw this different understanding of what water is, what water means. In one of the last sessions on Friday in the panel session, you heard, I believe it was the representative of Tajikistan saying, water is not a gift of God's. We need to value it economically, monetarily. And immediately after, I went to the session outside, which was led by indigenous communities. And the very first thing they said was, water is the biggest gift we've received from the Creator. So you have this huge disparity, which to me was also puzzling, because if you critically engaged with your speakers and those themes, I don't think this disparity would be so prevalent. So this is, as I said, still very much ongoing research and ongoing processing. I think, as Dona said, it's a lot to take in, it's a lot to process, but definitely a lot of interesting takeaway points, a lot of alarming takeaway points as well. So I'll finish on that and I pass it over to Jampel. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So before Jampel gets the floor, thanks, Paulina. Also from my side, this was, again, very, very interesting for both sharing some of your ongoing research, but also your hands-on observations of some of the disparities and tokenisms that are ongoing over there. And I think a lot of interesting questions for our debate have been raised that we can cover later. But now, indeed, it's time to hand over to the final speaker of today, Jampel. So with a general title, and now it's Jampel's job to get everything together nicely integrated. Reflections on the UN Water Conference 2023. Jampel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Philip, and thanks so much to Paulina and Dona for really introducing in such a brilliant way the reflections and what we experienced at the UN. So let's start from a little rhetorical question. How many of you, just by raise of thumbs up, have heard that water is precious and therefore you should turn off the water while you brush your teeth? I'm sure many of us. And then let's go to the next question. And how many of you heard or saw that sub-Saharan Africa is water scarce and that children in sub-Saharan Africa are dying of thirst? I guess thumbs up there as well are coming in. And how about the water wars of the future? Or let me say it in another way, the future wars that will be about water. How many of you heard this? So it seems like that there are some strong narratives. And what I find particularly interesting is that the world of water is a world dense with misconceptions and myths and urban myths. But in reality, those are much more than myths. As the puzzled expression of Michel Foucault would say, with discourse and narrative comes power. And with the manipulation of certain discourses, there is the possibility to take control over a complex societal phenomena. And I feel that what we've experienced at the UN was really mind-blowing and eye-opening in that sense. But I will get to the aspect of the conference in a second. So first of all, going back to the three generalized truths about saving water when you're brushing your teeth and the water wars and water scarce sub-Saharan Africa, I would like to share with you that in reality, when we look at the black box of water and we open it and look at it in more of an analytical way, there are several issues that actually can help us understand the world as it is, the socio-hydrological world as it is. For example, something that probably people didn't hear as much is that when we are eating 1 kilogram of beef, we are actually involved in the consumption of 16,000 liters of water, which very possibly have been consumed in Brazil to then be exported in the global north, maybe to feed some hamburgers at the UN Water Conference. So something that also very often people kind of forget about is that one of the richest areas in the world in terms of blue water, in terms of available water resources, is actually sub-Saharan Africa. So where do these misconceptions come from? Well, many of those are just probably reiterated by without a clear intention, but I do think that to a certain extent, some of those misconceptions are actually instrumental for the reproduction of a specific status quo and of specific interests. Another aspect, for example, which I will not enter into, is that there is clearly very strong evidence about the fact that it's not true that there will be water wars in the future. The literature there is quite in agreement that, especially in terms of interstate conflict, cooperation will prevail. So, with this in mind, being aware that the world of water is a world full of misconceptions and where it's really necessary to have a strong analytical approach in order to disentangle these phenomena that are both biophysical but also have very strong influence on society, we arrived at the UN. And as Philip, Dona, and Paulina mentioned, this was a high-level conference. It was actually not a conference, it was a summit. The first and previous UN Water Conference actually happened in Argentina in 1977. Since then, nothing like this ever happened again. What was the vision for this UN Water Conference, and what was the purpose of the UN Water Conference? As Paulina mentioned, we are in the 2018-2028 decade for water. And right now we are in the middle of this decade, and it's an important moment for the review of the UN water decade. So the whole idea around this conference was that the conference should have been inclusive, action-oriented, and cross-sectoral. But to do what? Was it just an occasion to get together, 7,000 people, representatives, and exchange ideas? No, I think there was actually much more. And what has been clearly stated in terms of the expected outcomes of the UN Water Conference is that there will be a document, the so-called Water Action Agenda, which has the potential to become an overarching institutional framework. So this is actually a particularly important moment at the UN level, and it's a particularly important moment for global governance. What we've experienced here is as I think I will not repeat many of the things that Dona and Paulina already repeated, is that there was, what I experienced personally, is that there was a clear agenda that has already been written. So the paradox of the situation is that we were there, all of us with our best intentions, to contribute and participate to this agenda, but it's an agenda that has been already written, and something that we can clearly describe, which we experienced empirically just by being in the rooms, is that this whole notion of inclusivity was fundamentally nothing else than tokenism. This is a word that Dona used many times in previous discussions, but I don't know if she mentioned it today. So it was striking to see how in every single high-level panel, in every single big room, in the rooms that mattered, there was always an indigenous representative. But then the message was one. And what I found incredibly entertaining, to say it in this way, was that there is a clear story that is being told by high-level people, by decision makers, and it's being told in many different occasions. But this story is coming across in a very coherent way. So, of course, it was quite puzzling to see that soon after the General Secretary Guterres, I think it was just the person before the final intervention, the president of Bayer, closing up in the plenary of the UN conference. That was also something that yeah, of course, calls for some perplexity, especially considering that this is a multinational company that is under trials for the development of pesticides that have been polluting watersheds all over the world, such as the Roundup. So in this atmosphere and experiencing the conference, I think for all of us, what was quite a surprise. I mean, we learned and we understood what was happening by being there, and also everything went particularly fast. We realized that as an accredited organization, so New Wave was an accredited organization, we were asked to submit a statement, an official statement, by midnight of the 24th. So the conference was ending on Friday the 24th, and all of the accredited organizations were asked to submit a statement to contribute to the UN Water Agenda. So fundamentally, we were there, and we had 3 hours to put together a statement, which was what would sign off the check that the accredited organizations actually did have a chance to contribute to the UN Water Agenda. And so we put together a statement in a rush, but I still find it quite reflecting quite well what we've experienced. And of course, there will be more time and more possibility to reflect on what are the outcomes and what were the discussions. But once again, and also listening to Dona and Paulina, I think it was quite clear that there is a story that is coming across. And the story fundamentally is a story of commodification of water resources, of transforming the whole narrative of valuing water, because water is important, is immediately becoming a narrative of pricing water, which of course has a very strong political economy implications. Water is being treated fundamentally as a technical engineeristic type of problem, and there is literally no attention to the socio-political dimension of water. And of course, water is treated as a huge private sector investment opportunity. The private sector is fundamental to invest and push forward the innovation and the technologies that are needed to solve those issues. I'm seeing Philip, so I have the doubt that perhaps I'm running out of time. And so to close it here, I think that maybe the last point that I also want to really highlight is that fundamentally what I experience is that powerful actors that are in a specific position of interest have actually been called to become the rule makers. And this is particularly problematic. I don't think here any of us has problems with the private actor being involved in sustainability, and that of course is what we hope for. But the issue is when private actors that pursue certain type of interests actually are the ones making rules. And we saw that there was a lot of influence of the private sector in that sense. And on the other side, the entire emphasis on the legal aspects, the rights and the justice was completely relegated to voluntary initiatives. And nothing was said about, for example, pushing forward any type of binding legal frameworks or any type of attentions on water rights. So ultimately, we found all of this experience quite problematic, but also it does really motivate us to engage more with the discussion.
Thank you, Jampel. And me reappearing on the screen was in no way a sign for you to stop. But I think given the limited amount of time that we still have, and that is 10 minutes in these 1 hour SDG Academies, I think it's wise to shift attention and open up the floor for our audience. So I think there are 2 ways to get engaged. Is one, you unmute yourself and you ask a question, ideally by first raising a hand, or you can also alternatively put your question in the chat and then Marta and I can monitor it. So who wants to raise an issue and ask a question to our 3 presenters? And if that's not the case, then of course I always have one in reserve for everyone. Let me just, and you can be super brief on that one. It's really something I was interested in to ask you. So what I saw is one of the outcomes, Jampel, you mentioned that already, is this idea of a water action agenda. And a large part of that is something that has been done in many other issue areas in global environment politics already, in climate and biodiversity, that is to open up a registry where anyone can register an initiative. And that's sort of a voluntary thing, which has no definition, no legal meaning, but it was celebrated by many commentators as the real outcome of this summit. 700, I think, 8 and counting initiatives, commitments registered. What is your take on that? Is that also tokenism, or is there anything tangible in those in those communications?
Is the question for me or for?
Well, it's a question to all of you, but it's yeah. Anyway, fine.
Dona, Paulina, do you want to go, or should I go?
You can start, and we can take over later.
Sure. Well, so fundamentally, my impression is that, as I mentioned before, is that there is an agenda that it's already set in stone, and there is a very clear. To me, this sounds like Chicago Boys 3.0. And it's interesting to think about the historical precedent that after the coup d'etat and the killing of Salvador Allende, the first reform that Pinochet's technicians put in place was actually on the water reform in Chile. And I think that there is a historical legacy there in terms of seeing the potential for water as a huge business opportunity, as a way to control society. We also need to be aware of the fact that there is a lot of historical interpretation of water as the main mean of control over society. Think about the Roman aqueducts and the book Rivers of Empire. So in that sense, I think that this is there is a clear agenda that has a very high level and a clear project which has the potential to be implemented at the global level. And so I'm really seeing all of these other initiatives, and especially now that I have experienced the UN Water Conference and seeing how we were, let's say, treated and how the different voices were included, then I'm even more convinced that this, can be called tokenism, or can be called fundamentally a way to actually give legitimacy to a very concrete water reform that seems to me has been discussed. And of course, this is not something that happened yesterday. This is not something that took place during the UN Water Conference. There have been commissions working on reforming water, on pricing water, that have been working for many years now. And I think that the feeling is that now the times are ripe to make a change at the global level. But of course, what the UN system and the international governance system has learned is that these type of reforms work much better if you find some legitimacy, and if you can present them as actually being inclusive and actually being well represented by all of the different voices.
Thank you, Jampel. There's I think a lot to say about that, but those were really good remarks. So I want to encourage the rest of the audience to also ask questions if you have. We have only a couple minutes left, so it's precious. Please put your questions in the chat, or ask them also directly to our speakers. Sebastian has a hand up, so please.
Yes, thank you for your comments. I was just wondering if you could briefly reflect on one of the panel sessions or one of the individual conversations you had that truly inspired you or showed you that great work is being done as well, and from where you would move forward to the future.
Nice. Who wants to tackle that really important question?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a take on this, because quite frankly, the entire flight coming back, I was really reflecting on, what surprised me, like pleasantly surprised me about this conference that I could also relay as a message. And really the most, I would say, stark and positive realization was two-part, but it's really about gender representation. So the first part is that for the first time, walking through the hallways of the UN headquarters in New York, I could see a lot of representation of women, also women of color. And in particular, when I had the chance to join the General Assembly and listen to the statements of member states, quite a few of the representatives of ministries of environment and so on were women. And for me, that was something that I imagine in 1977 was really not the case. So it was hopeful and inspiring. And the reason why I'm further inspired by this is because there has been research that shows that women in positions of leadership, let's say even in parliament, but also on environment, often result in certain governments or governments making commitments, stronger commitments towards environmental policies. And so for me, this is inspiring. I do, in my own inner critic and reflecting on this, question some aspects of it, because, for example, like I mentioned earlier, Kenya, whose statement was presented by the Ministry of Environment of Kenya, who is a woman, did relay the message that they plan to build 100 dams in the next 50 years. So again, it's about the frameworks in which they're operating, but I think it's still hopeful that there are more women in these roles. And personally for me, because I've attended multiple World Water Forums and National Water Weeks in different countries, and I've been previously part of the Water Youth Network, there are many young women in this network whom I could reconnect with at this conference and see them also moving up in their roles, running organizations, entering as policy advisors, and that was inspiring. So for me, I would say this aspect is hopeful.
Thanks a lot. Really, really important point. Paulina, do you want to maybe come in on that as well from your perspective?
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly add, I mean, the last bit that I already touched upon, the youth as well. I think that to me, there was one crucial moment in the conference that I don't think I can like ever erase from my mind. I was in one session where there was a youth representative and she did not speak at all. She was not asked anything. And then in the end, she was asked to make the closing remarks. So they said, okay, the moderator goes, okay, and now for the closing remarks, we have this youth representative. And it was brilliant. It was a young girl. She was from, I want to say she was from Nigeria. And she said, this is not the statement I wanted to make, but I feel like I have to change my plan. And she just went on to this 5-minute rant about how young people or people of color or indigenous communities are invited just to tick a box, and she's done with it. And she said, especially with young people, I've been so many times invited just to make closing remarks or just to say one word. I want to be heard. I want to make an impact. I want you guys to recognize that young people are the innovative force. We have innovative ideas. We are the ones who in our city are actually running a lot of water initiatives. And it's time to make a change. I hear a lot of talk. You, older generation, are great at talking, but you're not good at doing. And it was brilliant. I think that's, you see that people are actually standing up and that there is a change that's actually going to happen or is already happening. So that to me was definitely a great moment to remember.
Yeah, thank you, Paulina, for sharing that. I think that's a really, really nice comment, maybe also for sort of coming to the close of this meeting. I know an hour is very short, but I think we heard really stimulating and quite critical reflections on the World Water Conference Summit. Some things that stuck in my mind is definitely the word tokenism. I also was thinking, is it really worth all the money and CO2 that's emitted? One question we always have with this big summit, but also actually here and now in the end, a couple of hopeful comments that maybe it's not in the prefabricated agenda that was agreed upon and in the larger narratives, but actually in the cracks in those narratives. And that's when stuff happens that is unscripted and unpredictable. So I think that's maybe the spin I want to give. I think it will critically also depend on the weak implementation of whatever the agenda on water is, because you mentioned it a couple of times, it's both a midway point for the SDGs, SDG 6, but also for the decade. So this is sort of the last chance there can be a sizable impact. And I think it's important that researchers such as you from the New Wave Network and other colleagues from IBM who have been there, many other colleagues, participate and bring their voices, though maybe not heard, to the table, because research, I think, will make that process a little bit better. So in that spirit, I want to also thank everyone who took time out of their agendas, but in particular, the organizers, Marta, and the speakers for your insights. Thanks for joining us despite the jet lag, and to be continued in our next SDG Academy. Please look at our website of ASI and hope to see you soon again. Thanks, everyone.